It's stunning, following the Wall Street crash, the fact that there has been literally no expression of any key player from Wall Street of regret or apology for having brought down the whole economy. Nor is there any sense of shame or embarrassment about continuing to extract exorbitant bonuses for producing absolutely nothing of value to the rest of the society.
You identify yourself as traditional conservative. Would you tell me a little bit more about your background and how your views strongly differ from the conservatives that we know of today?
Yeah, I've always thought of myself as coming out of a very conservative background. I grew up in a small town, and my family, we believed in local control and community responsibility, community values. And I've come to realize over time that there really are two fundamentally different definitions of conservative in the United States. And one is about that kind of traditional community family values in a positive sense, not the hate community sense. But the traditional meaning of conservative is actually a monarchist. The term originated from the period when democracy was beginning to come in, and the conservatives were the ones that were defending monarchy and central control. And so we have this tension in the United States between conservatives who are really the classic monarchist type conservatives who believe in elite rule, and the other conservatives are those that believe in local control. And of course, in many ways, by my understanding of conservative, much of what I advocate really reflects basic conservative values as I understood them, which is, involves a suspicion of any concentrations of institutional power, and the importance of what I think of as real democracy and real markets, which are local, involve local control, but also involve individual action within a framework of community values and mutual responsibility and accountability.
Now that's markedly different though than our society today, isn't it? Local control, local economy. Now it's all about globalization, the global economy, and huge corporations.
Well, the whole dynamic of what we've been introduced to as globalization is a process driven by corporate interests to essentially eliminate national boundaries and eliminate the capacity of governments to create rules that maintain a sense of community interest or national interest in the economy, so that corporations consolidate their power and essentially rule the world beyond any kind of democratic accountability. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the counter to corporate globalization is not a xenophobic closing in at the community level, but it really is a globalization of people power. A globalization of people waking up to the need to restore a sense of place, a sense of community, but to do it within a framework of cooperation with each other around all of the world. Now, I'm often struck, that we're supposed to believe that, if we grow our own food and put up any restrictions against food imports, that we're hurting farmers in Africa because we're not, we're cutting them off from the ability to export their food to us. Now, that's part of the corporate globalization story. Because if you think about it, now, I've lived in Africa. I mean, the thing that Africans most need is food. They need to control their own agriculture, to grow their own food, to feed themselves. And the idea that we do them a favor by importing their food so that we eat their food rather than they eat their food, it really is bizarre once you think about it. You begin to realize that really is part of the corporate propaganda. That to benefit the people in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and all the poor countries, the first step is to relinquish our control over their assets and their wealth and their land and their water, so that they can use those resources and their labor to produce the things that they need for a better life, rather than setting up a system where we expropriate that wealth for our own benefit and leave them without.
But isn't our institutions creating this leverage to do exactly those things?
Well, the dominant institutions in the world that are shaping economic policy have been the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF. And properly understood, all three of them are really working for the corporate interest. And they're promoting rules that consolidate this global concentration of corporate power. Now it's interesting, when I started to wake up to these issues when I was living in Asia, where I lived 15 years. And it began to strike me that when the World Bank or the IMF came out and they were advising countries, the basic argument was always, agriculture is a very tiny percentage of a developed economy, of developed countries' GDP. So it's not important. You should be using your land and your resources for things that produce a higher economic value. So devote your farmland to factories, to golf courses, to housing developments, to whatever, because those pay more. And you can always import your food. And you begin to think about that, well, my goodness, if every country is assuming that it will import its food, who's going to produce it? And whatever percentage food is of the GDP, don't we all want to eat? And we want foods. And food is one of the most absolutely important products that the economy produces. And so if we're not developing the capacity to produce our food, to provide a good diet for everyone, what is this economy about anyway? And so you begin to realize, the whole logic that we have been taught in terms of what is a sound national policy and sound development policy has nothing to do with the real interests of people. It really only has to do with the interests of corporations. And so we need to stand up and do our own thinking and turn most of those arguments on their head. The bigger model I've come to realize is that we humans have gotten so far out of balance with Earth's biosphere that we are causing the collapse of all the critical environmental systems. And the way we need to think about reorganizing ourselves is to mimic the dynamics and structure of Earth's biosphere, which is locally rooted everywhere. It's kind of a fractile structure, that the closer you get down to the bottom of the pyramid, the more you are intimately adapted you are, and the more self-reliant within very small spaces in terms of the utilization of that material and that energy to optimize the support of life. And then you keep expanding out. But it's always within a framework of local energy, water, materials exchange, self-reliance. And that's essentially the kind of way that we need to think about our economies. The more locally we meet our own needs, including with household food production and all the different elements of urban agriculture, and then gradually expanding out, but always first using our own resources to produce our own needs and trading at the margin rather than starting out thinking about our economy, what can we produce to sell to somebody else, someplace else.
Tell me about Adam Smith. You write in your book, When Corporations Rule the World, that he was a great influence on your views and your writing.
Well, if you properly understand Adam Smith's most famous work, The Wealth of Nations, it was a tirade against corporate monopolies. I mean, the monopolies of his time were crown corporations that were licensed by the state to colonize the economies of other countries or to dominate particular sectors in the domestic economy. And he was very much against that kind of power. His ideal of the market and of the local entrepreneur, the local artisan, the local farmer looked much more like a farmer's market than it looked like a global economy monopolized by Goldman Sachs, Monsanto, Walmart, and the other major corporate predators. Now, the thing that's really interesting here is that what we're taught to think of as a global market economy is a capitalist economy, which is an economy that is focused on a concentration of corporate monopoly power, which is acutely anti-market in its very conception, as well as anti-democratic. Because real markets depend on smaller enterprises that are rooted in place. And in terms of speaking of Adam Smith, many people say that the book that he considered most important was his book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was addressing the question of why is it that we as humans have a natural tendency to care about the well-being of our neighbor. And it's very clear if you look at the bigger picture that Adam Smith was assuming a market economy comprised of local buyers and sellers who operated within a framework of moral principles, which is a total contrast to our current Wall Street economy, about which I think he would be totally appalled.
Would he be surprised?
I doubt it. But I think the thing that would truly trouble him is that this abomination that is now presented to us as a market economy is also presented to us as the actualization of Adam Smith's ideal, and Adam Smith's writing is used to legitimate it. And I think he would be deeply disturbed by that.
And you say that capitalism poses a direct threat to democracy.
You know, capitalism is basically about rule by people who control the money system and who control economic power. And as you look at the driving force of most of our biggest corporations, it is derived to monopolize control of markets, to monopolize control of resources, to monopolize control of money, so that they can extract monopoly profits, unearned profits that have nothing to do with their contribution to society. That is a fundamentally anti-market concept. You know, it's a foundational market principle that to have a proper self-regulating, in a sense, market economy, each individual enterprise has to be too small to be able to influence or manipulate the market price. So the whole drive of Wall Street corporations is to overpower the market so that they can control it, so that they can extract unearned profits. Now, at a political level, we also see so clearly that the greater the concentration of economic power, then the greater the control of the people who control that power over our politicians. And of course, it's an interplay because the outcome of our elections has come to depend more and more on the messages that go out through corporate media, particularly corporate-owned television. And so the only way that the politicians can get the money that these TV networks charge for their advertising is to get it from the people who have the most money, to get it from the biggest corporations. And so they inevitably become beholden to those corporate interests. So we have a democracy that is best defined as a $1 one vote democracy rather than a one person one vote democracy, which is the only concept of democracy that has any real meaning.
And that fits into the recent Supreme Court decision where it was granting First Amendment rights to corporations, which is not the first time in history corporations have had that right.
Well, there have been a whole series of Supreme Court decisions that increase the rights and powers of corporations relative to the rights and interests of ordinary people. Now, as you look back on it historically, one of the things you begin to realize is that we were actually not founded as a democracy. We were founded as a plutocracy. The folks who wrote our Constitution and who originally framed our government were all white males, most of them property owners, and they actually shaped the Constitution in a way that enshrined their power and the rule of the white male property owning elite. Now, a lot of dimensions to that, but one dimension was the creation of a Supreme Court that had ultimate veto power over the legislative branches of government. Justices appointed for life. Now, where would those justices come from? They almost inevitably have law school degrees, and of course, back at that time, there were only a handful of law schools, and they were schools that were populated by the children of the elite of the society. So this effectively gave the right of veto power to the ruling landed elites in the country. And we have had periods when the Supreme Court has been a bit more progressive, but for the most part, it has performed as an institution defending the establishment, defending the plutocracy, which means rule by the wealthiest people in the society. And that Citizens United decision was one of the most profound demonstrations of that reality. I mean, it is totally stunning that the Supreme Court, supposedly our highest legal body and our most sophisticated legal scholars, that the justices do not understand the difference between the rights of people and the rights of corporations, or understand the difference between a dollar as a vote and a person as a vote. It is deeply troubling when you see it, but part of the reforms and restructuring we need to address is a restructuring of the Supreme Court.
Is it too strong a word, in your view, to say that our institutions, our public institutions, are corrupt?
We have a system that is controlled by people who control money. It's a system run by and for money. Now, part of what is truly disturbing about it is when you begin to realize the extent to which a lot of the key players in Wall Street and a lot of our politicians actually fit the psychological profile of a psychopath. I mean, it's stunning following the Wall Street crash. The fact that there has been literally no expression of any key player from Wall Street of regret or apology for having brought down the whole economy. Nor is there any sense of shame or embarrassment about continuing to extract exorbitant bonuses for producing absolutely nothing of value to the rest of the society, but playing games that are patently destructive of the rest of society. Now, the only human beings who are able to act that way consistently are people who are clinically, psychologically deeply damaged, that represent some of the most damaged people in our society. This is a reality. Now, we can talk about it as corrupt. Yes, it is corrupt, but it's, the system itself is corrupt because the design of the very system supports that kind of antisocial, psychopathic pursuit of a very narrow self-interest that is ultimately deeply destructive of the long-term interests of the society.